Well, good morning, everyone. It's interesting with how we measure the passage of time and the milestones that we come across. Sometimes they're common things that we all have, that we all recognize, like holidays, like the one we've just celebrated, and sometimes they're very personal things. I have gone through 2 full notebooks full of sermons at this point, where I've written them and then preached from the book. And I'm now on to my 3rd one. The last one lasted me from 2015 to just last week. So we'll see how long it takes for me to fill this one up, since I'm preaching at a much higher frequency than I was before. Our lesson for today, and my sort of inaugural lesson for this notebook, is in Matthew chapter 13. So if you'd like to turn there, we'll be talking from that passage today. When we're talking about lessons, it's worth sort of thinking about what their function is and how they are used. What I mean by that is, when a teacher wants to convey an idea, he can't just think about the subject matter, he also has to think about the audience. As many of you know, I started substitute teaching recently, and I've had a couple of opportunities to go to different levels of schooling, all the way from high school down to the youngest grade I've taught so far has been 2nd grade. That perspective has been helpful, because some of the things that you take for granted as an adult are not so obvious to kids at various different levels. For example, I've never tried to teach math, but when you teach 2nd grade, you have to teach a little bit of everything. And when it came time to teach the math lesson, the kids were asking me, how do you add, double-digit numbers together? And I was like, well, that was about the extent of it, because in my head, I know how much it is by just looking at the problem. And so I couldn't tell them how you actually do it right off the top of my head, because I'm so used to just adding double-digit numbers that it was second nature to me, and the process was kind of lost someplace back in the back of my mind. And I'm afraid that sometimes we may come across a similar problem when we're teaching as Christians. If you've been a Christian your whole life and somebody asks you what you believe in, you're like, oh, well, I'm a Christian. So, what Christians believe in? The Bible, that kind of stuff. And it may not always be that simple for the people who are listening to you. Now, Jesus definitely had this problem, as we're going to be looking at in Matthew in chapter 13. He was trying to teach people some lessons by using the parables that he was so well known for using. Now, we're actually going to skip one of the most famous ones here, and we're not going to look at the sower and the seeds there at the beginning of chapter 13. But rather, I'd like for us to start about halfway through at verse 24 of chapter 13. Later on in this passage, Jesus is going to say, a prophet is not without honor in his hometown, except in his hometown and in his own household. The lessons he was trying to teach were lost on the people who thought they already knew him. And I'm afraid that for Christians, sometimes we might be in a similar, if not totally identical position, where we're too familiar with the gospel, and sometimes we don't know how to teach it. It's so second nature to us that we kind of take it for granted, and we don't give it the honor that it's due. Talking about the good news in God's kingdom, Jesus presented a parable starting in verse 24 that goes like this. Jesus presented another parable to them, saying, the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a man who sowed good seed in his field. But while his men were sleeping, his enemy came and sowed tares among the wheat and went away. But when the wheat sprouted and bore grain, then the tares became evident also. The slaves of the landowner came and said to him, Sir, did you not sow good seed in your field? How then does it have tares? And he said to them, An enemy has done this. And the slaves said to him, Do you want us then to go and gather them up? But he said, "No, for while you are gathering up the tares, you may uproot the wheat with them. Allow both to grow together until the harvest. And in the time of the harvest, I will say to the reapers, first gather up the tares and bind them in bundles and burn them up, but gather the wheat into my barn." He presented another parable to them, saying, "The kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed, which a man took and sowed in his field. And this is smaller than all the other seeds, but when it is full grown, it is larger than the garden plants and becomes a tree, so that the birds of the air come and nest in its branches." Now, if the branches nested, that would be something remarkable. He spoke another parable to them, saying, "The kingdom of heaven is like leaven, which a woman took and hid in 3 pecks of flour until all was leavened." And all these things Jesus spoke to the crowds in parables, and he did not speak to them without a parable. This was to fulfill what was spoken through the prophet, "I will open my mouth in parables, I will utter things hidden since the foundation of the world." We're going to go through the remaining 3 parables and an explanation of the first one in just a moment, but I wanted to spend some time in this first passage where Jesus is speaking to a crowd of people versus his disciples directly. The first parable he presents, the parable of the tares and the wheat, is like most other parables, oftentimes taken out of context and put on its own and taught as a full lesson. Now, there's a lot to this lesson, and you can take a lot of time teaching it, so I don't blame preachers for doing that. But much like the parable that came before it, the parable of the soils, without the full passage that Matthew is arranging them in, and that Jesus was teaching them in, you might lose some of the context. Now, just to remind our audience today, the parable of the types of soils that was at the beginning of this chapter is a parable about the receptiveness of the hearts of the people that the good news is coming to, right? Jesus is saying some people are very receptive at first, but then life comes along and troubles hit them and they can't withstand it, and so they fall away. They don't follow what the good news has taught them. Next, there's some people who are very receptive at first, and then it's a very shallow reception. And so the roots go down and they hit rock and they immediately die out. And then there's some people who don't hear it at all, basically. The seed is like it's being scattered on hard ground and birds are coming and eating it. He says the message was sent to them, but they didn't even begin to receive it. And then there's some people who are good soil. And whenever they hear the message of the good news, it goes into their hearts and grows into what it's supposed to be. So with that context, now he talks about that receptive heart and people who grow, and he's saying that sometimes with the good produce, where the good news comes into people's hearts, there's also going to be something else there, some other contaminating element, something that wasn't supposed to grow there. And he will explain it a little bit further. But I wanted to make sure that we have the context that Jesus and Matthew, in recording these parables, put them together for a purpose, and having them all together is going to be helpful. So, once again, we've got the tares and the wheat, the mustard seed, the leaven so far, and now we're going to get the explanation from Jesus about what the tares and the wheat mean. In verse 36, he says, "Then he left the crowds and went into the house. His disciples came with him and said, 'Explain to us this parable of the tares in the field.' And he said to them, 'The one who sows the good seed is the Son of Man. The field is the world. And as far as the good seed goes, those are the sons of the kingdom, and the tares are the sons of the evil one. The enemy who sowed them is the devil, and the harvest is the end of the age. The reapers are angels. So just as the tares are gathered up and burned with the fire, so it shall be at the end of the age. The Son of Man will send forth his angels, and they will gather out of his kingdom all stumbling blocks and those who commit lawlessness, and will throw them into the furnace of the fire. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Then the righteous will shine forth as the sun in the kingdom of their Father. He who has ears, let him hear. The kingdom of heaven is like a treasure hidden in the field, which a man found and hid again. And from joy over it, he goes and sells all that he has and buys that field. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a merchant seeking fine pearls. And a upon finding one pearl of great value, he went and sold all that he had and bought it. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a dragnet cast into the sea, and gathering fish of every kind. And when it is filled, they drew it up onto the beach, and they sat down and gathered the good fish into containers, but the bad they threw away. So it will be at the end of the age. The angels will come and take the wicked out from among the righteous, and will throw them into the furnace of fire. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Have you understood all these things? And they said to him, Yes. Jesus said to them, Therefore every scribe who has become a disciple of the kingdom of heaven is like a head of a household, who brings out of his treasure things old and new. Okay, so as we're looking at these passages, you'll notice that same phrase is repeated over and over. The kingdom of heaven is like. So when God is in your life, and when he's ruling over your life, it's going to be like this. And also, the kingdom of heaven is like, when the church comes, it's going to have these qualities. It can mean both of those things. And I think in this passage, there's both of those layers laying on top of each other, where he's explaining to the people who were there with him, Jesus is, and then Matthew was talking to the early church that was reading it, and then there's the additional layer of us reading both of those layers. So as long as we have that perspective, we can get a proper understanding of what the application is for us. So you'll notice some similarities right away between the first and the last parables. The parable of the tares and the parable of the dragnet are both talking about this process that was already laid out in the parables of the soil, right? That we're supposed to go out and spread the word, and once that's done, then we leave the sorting out to the Lord. There is a very strong tendency among any group of human beings, churches, sports teams, schoolyard, cliques, whatever it happens to be. You put a group of people together, and they'll start dividing themselves up. And part of the thing that Jesus was trying to protect his people against was exactly that. But we've talked very recently about unity and how much that is important for God's people. And Jesus was laying the groundwork for that here. He's saying, don't worry about the sorting out of who's good and who's bad. We got to let the good and the bad grow up together so that we know who they are when all the sorting happens at the end. It's not our job to start trying to figure out which ones are good believers and which ones are bad ones. Now, I don't want to muddle the message too much, so I hope I'm not stepping on my own toes by saying this. This is not about false teachers. This is about believers. I will say that. Because the New Testament spends a lot of time saying who's a good teacher, who's a bad teacher. All right, now that we got that aside, when it comes to the everyday believers and the people we're going to be interacting with, it's not our job as believers to go and find the other believers who aren't believing right and getting rid of them. Say, oh, you're not fit to be around this church. You get out of here. You're not a true Christian. That's not the goal of the believer. The role and the outcome that we are looking to fulfill is to spread the seed as far as we can and let God sort out the rest. 9 times out of 10, you're not going to be, or even more than that, I'd say, maybe 99 cases out of 100, you're not going to be applying those tests for bad teachers that we're worried about in other parts of the New Testament, because you're not going to be dealing with bad teachers. You're not going to have evil preachers in front of you, most of the time. And most of the time, you're looking at fellow sinners who just need the good news. And that's what Jesus is really concerned with, and what Matthew is concerned with here. He's saying, spread the good news, make sure it reaches as many people as possible. So with those bookends here, there are a few other lessons. The 2 other public parables, right, the mustard seed and the leaven, are talking about another aspect of the kingdom of heaven. Let's just read them again since they're only a couple verses. The kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed, which a man took and sowed in his field. And this is smaller than all the other seeds, but when it is fully grown, it is larger than all the other garden plants and becomes a tree, so that the birds of the air come and nest in its branches. And he spoke another parable to them. The kingdom of heaven is like leaven, which a woman took and hid in 3 pecks of flour until all was leavened. The germination of the word, of the good kingdom doesn't take much. That's the whole point of that, right? It's pretty obvious from both of those lessons. You just need a little bit of a start, and it'll spread. It'll become this tree that's big enough from the tiniest seed you can imagine, so that it will be big enough that even birds come and nest in its branches. And also leaven, yeast, it doesn't take much, and it'll start spreading, it'll start rising. If anyone's ever baked any kind of bread, you know it only takes a few minutes for that little lump of dough that you've put together to be full of air bubbles from that yeast activating, right, breaking down the sugars and turning sugars into carbon dioxide. The whole thing's bubbling in just a little bit of time in a warm space. So we get these ideas. A little seed can become a big tree. A little bit of yeast can leaven a whole bunch of flour. This is something that we can understand. So the lesson for us is the good news of God is the same. When we tell the good news of Jesus to others, it can spread in ways that may not always be obvious from how small that initial contact is. And when Jesus was teaching the crowds, he let them know that. He said, the kingdom of heaven is going to be like, because this little message I'm giving to you now is going to spread among all of you. And indeed, we can see that by the time that Pentecost came around and people were coming to find these people who followed Jesus and become one of them, there were 3,000 people that were baptized in one day. So we get what exactly Jesus is not only prophetically speaking about, but the principle of his lesson. So moving on, after the explanation of the tares, he gives two more parables. The kingdom of heaven is like a treasure hidden in the field, which a man found and hid again. And from joy over it, he goes and sells all that he has and buys that field. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a merchant seeking fine pearls, and upon finding one pearl of great value, he went and sold all he had and bought it. Now, I tell you what, either one of those things are very profitable business undertakings. If you wanted to make money off of that treasure, you wouldn't sell everything you would have. You'd want to get the best deal you could and probably negotiate it down. Now, I was trying to plow that field, and there were rocks. There's all kinds of stuff in that field. It's no good. You give that to me for a cut rate price, and I'll get that treasure whenever this sucker sells me his field. And that pearl, if you're a pearl merchant, you don't sell your entire stock to buy one pearl. That's no way to make a profit. These guys aren't thinking in business terms. They're thinking in terms of how precious that thing is to themselves. They're not planning on getting rid of that field and that treasure. And they're not planning on getting rid of that pearl. They're not trying to turn around and sell it to somebody else. They're trying to acquire it at any price. And that's the lesson here. The good news to those who are willing to receive it, to those who can see its value, is such that they'll give up anything and everything they have to in order to obtain it and to hold on to it. Now, the good news about the good news is that unlike material things, you don't have to sell it to gain value out of it. Because like a little tiny seed or a little bit of yeast, all you have to do is spread it and it'll do the work for itself. It's infinitely reproducible, just like any kind of spoken word is. As long as you're spreading it along, the good news does all of the work for you, and it spreads out and becomes what it needs to be. The kingdom of heaven is like, and it fulfills itself as that message is spread. And more importantly, as I said, the structure to this is that Jesus is explaining not only the principles of what the good news acts like, but also our role in it, right? As I mentioned, we don't need to worry about how good the produce of our sowing the seed is. All our job is, in this particular sense, is to spread the seed and let it go. The ones who do the reaping and the sorting at the end of the harvest are different crew. Our only role, the only thing we've been hired to do, is to sow the seed. And now, our only role is to, make sure that we're doing the right thing now with what we have on hand, and not concern ourselves with the other people, or more accurately, angels, who are coming to do the rest of the work. I don't know if you've ever worked with somebody who's always trying to do your job for you. I don't know, I'm maybe just a little bit prideful, but if I've been given a job and I know how to do it, and somebody else comes along while I'm working and tries to fix my work while I'm doing it, I kind of get my back up a little bit. Get out of my space, let me work. You know, we don't need to step on the angels' territory. They're going to do the sorting for us. We can rest assured that we've done our part by just spreading the good news to start with. And boy, isn't that an easier job than having to go around and police ourselves and make sure that other people are doing what they're supposed to be doing. Because that is the message that's been delivered through all of these things. But finally, as a way of conclusion, let's look at what actually happened in Jesus' life, because I'd like to temper our expectations a little bit. When Jesus had finished these parables, he departed from there. He came to his hometown and began teaching them in their synagogue, so that they were astonished. And they said, "Where did this man get this wisdom and these miraculous powers? Is this not the carpenter's son? Is not his mother called Mary, and his brothers James and Joseph and Simon and Judas? And his sisters, are they not all with us? Where then did this man get all these things?" But they took offense at him. But Jesus said to them, "A prophet is not without honor, except in his hometown and in his own household." And he did not do many miracles there because of their unbelief. Well, you know, I think one of the things that we need to think about when we're talking about miracles is the same thing we've been talking about when we're talking about the good news. That it has a purpose, it has an intended outcome. And you don't just do a miracle to do a miracle. A miracle is, as I always like to say, divine intervention for the purpose of confirmation of divine authority. God steps in and says, "This is my servant, they're doing what I want them to do." Whether it was Jesus, one of the prophets, whoever it was, the apostles, he was always just putting his stamp of approval. The miracle wasn't just, shock and awe, demonstration of fantastical abilities and things like that. It was always just sort of, like I said, that stamp of approval. That was their badge that they could flash and say, "Hey, God's on my side. Listen to what I have to say." So when Jesus went to a group of people who didn't want to receive his message, he didn't waste his time with a lot of miracles. Now, when it says he didn't do many miracles, I gotta assume if somebody was sick, he healed them, because that's just the kind of character he had. That's the kind of person he was. He wasn't withholding any good deeds from anyone. But he also didn't have to, feed 5,000 people or whatever it needed to be to confirm his message, because the message itself wasn't being received. So the other part of all of this, as we're being sowers, as we're going out and doing our work of spreading the good news, is you don't have to wait around for the soil to be good to start spreading the good news someplace. If you've got a spot that you're walking by and scattering the seed, and it lands on the road, don't go scoop it back up and try and spread it somewhere else. Keep going. There are plenty of other good pieces of soil that you'll come across as you're sowing. And that's kind of the lesson for us here today. We're not judging beforehand, during, or after the process of spreading good news. We're just spreading the good news. And that makes not only our jobs a lot easier, but by taking the pressure of judgment off of us and putting it on God, but it also means that we can be easier on ourselves, right? Sometimes it's hard to feel like you're doing the right thing when you don't see results. Don't worry about that. Because everybody who's ever planted a garden knows that those little tiny seeds in the dirt don't show up for a long time, and sometimes it's like, did the frost get them? Are they growing? Did I plant it in the right spot? Is the pH balance right? Did I water it enough? You gotta wait. You'll find out when you find out. And we're in the same point in our role ones who are sowing the seed of good news here. And don't worry if you can't do any miracles either, because Jesus held off on miracles from time to time. Miracles, like the good news, as I mentioned, they have a purpose and an audience. They confirm faith, and they don't coerce compliance. So don't worry about trying to be a super Christian and be such a perfect person that you can perfectly convince people that God is working in your life. Because if Jesus couldn't convince people by being Jesus, then you're not going to have any easier of a time by just being you. So you might as well just do the best you can. Well, I hope that this lesson has been encouraging for you today, and that's something that can uplift you and show you some guidance from the Word as to how we can conduct ourselves in a satisfactory way when we're trying to spread the good news of Jesus to the people we come in contact with. I pray that we can continue to do that from this church as a group, but also as individuals as we live our lives from day to day among the people that we come in contact with. If someone has not responded to the good news and hasn't been baptized, we know from the scriptures that that is the proper way to respond to the message that Jesus has brought us, and we'd like to always offer that opportunity. If anyone needs to take advantage of this time, they can do so. But if anyone has prayers or concerns of any kind, we can answer for you. We'd like to offer that opportunity as well, and you can come forward now as we stand and we sing.